Today on the Perception in Action podcast, a look at how we can apply the concepts of perceptual learning to sports. How can we effectively educate an athlete's attention or help them to calibrate? So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from Arizona State University and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. Before I dive into today's topic, I wanted to tell you about a couple new things going on around here. First, we have created Twitter and Facebook accounts for my program here at ASU, Human Systems Engineering. The reason I'm mentioning this on the podcast is that I've had quite a few people contact me expressing an interest in furthering their education related to skill acquisition and motor learning. We are currently working on some exciting new initiatives related to this in the HSE program, and when details are available, they'll be posted on our sites. There will also eventually be photos and videos of our labs, so please consider following and liking. The links for these are in the show notes. Second, I've created a very brief survey and I'd love to have you participate. It has 4 questions. The first asks you to choose which articles you'd like me to cover in the next news segment of the podcast. The second asks you to indicate which topics you'd like me to cover more on the podcast in general. And finally, the last 2 questions give you space to tell me what I'm doing well on the podcast and what you think could be improved. I would greatly appreciate any constructive feedback you might have. You can find a link to the survey by going to perceptionaction.com/survey1. Okay, on to the topic du jour, applying perceptual learning to improve sports performance.
Can't you see what's in front of you? Don't feel the need to hang on to the prize.
In my last episode, I introduced the concepts of education of attention, education of intention, calibration, and information for learning in context of the theory of direct learning. Today I want to move from theory to practice by looking at research that has investigated these ideas in sporting contexts. Surprisingly, there's not actually been that much research done which specifically focuses on perceptual learning, as I've been defining it in this mini-series. If you do a literature search on perceptual learning in sport, you will see it's used fairly loosely, with studies talking about more cognitive aspects of skill. Remember, as I've been discussing it, perceptual learning only considers our ability to detect or pick up information from our environment. In 2014, DeVoe and Seitz published an article in which they consider how basic, laboratory research on perceptual learning could be applied to quote-unquote achieve practical changes in vision. In this article, they discuss some key approaches that have been shown to facilitate perceptual learning in the lab. These include training with a diverse set of stimuli, optimizing the stimulus presentation, using multisensory stimuli, and consistently reinforcing performance. As an example, they refer to a baseball training study they also published in 2014. I actually discussed and heavily critiqued this study way back in episode 2 of the podcast. To remind you, this study involved perceptual training of contrast sensitivity, kind of a fancier version of a visual acuity test. The participants were college baseball batters. To optimize the stimulus, they used what are called Gabor patches. These are kind of blurred dark and light bars. I've included a picture in the show notes. They are optimal because research has shown that they produce the strongest single response you can get from a neuron in our visual cortex. Training was made diverse by including a range of target orientations and locations. Sounds were used to make the stimuli multisensory, and finally they emphasized reinforcement by gamifying the task, such that participants receive bonuses for performance. After the training, players showed both improvements in their visual acuity and contrast sensitivity, and some measures of batting performance. There were some problems with this study that make the results very difficult to interpret. Go back to episode 2 if you want to hear all the gory details. But in terms of applying perceptual learning to sport, there are a couple things from this study I want to highlight. First, on the positive side, the factors they identified as being important for effective perceptual learning are good ones. In particular, optimizing the stimulus and reinforcement. Imagine you're trying to train a soccer goalkeeper to be able to better detect the direction and depth the ball is headed on a corner kick, so they can better decide whether to come out and punch it away. If I want to get effective perceptual learning in this scenario, the trajectories you present to the keeper need to be customized or optimized based on their skill level. If you present a novice keeper with very small differences in trajectory, they may not be able to tell them apart and get frustrated. While for an expert, presenting trajectories that are very different would be too easy. Remember, to get perceptual learning, we need to be sitting right around a person's perceptual threshold. That is, stimuli that they can just barely tell apart. And of course, this will be very different for each person. In terms of reinforcement, when the training stimuli are near your perceptual threshold, it makes the task extremely hard and exhausting. Imagine sitting in a doctor's office for an hour doing a hearing test with sounds that were just loud enough for you to hear. Because perceptual learning involves such difficulty, you need to keep people focused and motivated. Turning to the negative side of DeVoe and Seitz' article, for me they're completely missing the point of perceptual learning in applied contexts like sports. As I've discussed over the past 2 episodes, perceptual learning involves the ability to detect information that is highly specific to the task being performed. Last time I checked, a baseball is not an object that is made up of dark and light bars, and that sits completely still for you to look at. It has laces that create specific and useful visual patterns depending on the pitch type, and it travels at incredible speeds. Training with Gabor patches is not perceptual learning for baseball, it's perceptual learning for a contrast sensitivity task. The information participants are learning to pick up is not specific and relevant to the actual task they're going to perform. It's specific to the laboratory task. In other words, they're educating their attention to non-specifying variables. Perceptual learning is not just improving our general perceptual abilities. As I've discussed several times on the podcast, there's pretty much zero evidence that this will transfer to a specific context like baseball batting. As more specific evidence of this, I'll refer you to episode 10C of the podcast. In this episode, I discussed the Ultimize app, which was developed largely on the basis of these authors' perceptual learning research. The FTC would go on to charge the makers of the app with deceptive claims for the statement that it could be used to quote-unquote improve a user's vision.
Far too long apart. I can't wait to see you. I can't wait to see you.
Okay, let's now look at some perceptual learning research which has used more sport-specific information. A great example of this was a study published in 2013 by Nick Smeaton, Raoul Weiss, and David Jacobs. This study involved training to improve the ability of a tennis player to anticipate the direction of a serve based on the server's body language or kinematics. But hold on there, Rob. When you first started talking about perceptual learning, didn't you say it doesn't involve anticipation? Are you changing the rules now? Okay, hear me out. Yes, we can learn to better judge the trajectory of a ball without having to learn to anticipate based on body language. For example, by educating our attention to perceptual variables which better specify its time of arrival and where it will bounce. However, when we consider anticipation in and of itself, there's actually perceptual learning involved. That is, to be able to anticipate serve direction based on kinematics, a player needs to become attuned to the information that gives the serve direction away. Maybe it's the movement of the hips or the angle of the ball toss. So learning to anticipate involves perceptual learning itself. Hope that makes sense. Anyways, the study by Smeaton and colleagues was essentially an extension of the billiard ball study by Jacobs and Michaels I talked about last episode. If you recall, in experiment 2 of that study, it was found that you could speed perceptual learning by artificially selecting conditions so that the non-specifying variables were made completely useless during training. In this follow-up study, participants viewed dynamic stick figures of a tennis server and were asked to judge which direction they felt the serve would go. The use of the stick figures allowed the researchers to neutralize the anticipation cues from different parts of the body. For example, in experiment 2 of the study, the stick figure servers were modified so that for one group, information from the upper part of the body, that is the shoulder, arm, and racket, was neutralized by making sure there were no direction-specific differences in these areas. So, for example, if the racket angle normally varied with different serve directions, it was kept the same for all serves. For this group, serve direction differences in the lower body were still present and could be used to aid in anticipation. This is an interesting manipulation because previous research has shown that novices tend to focus on the upper body and racket when anticipating tennis serves, while experts use the whole body and as a result anticipate with a higher degree of accuracy. So in other words, the novices in Smeaton and colleagues' study were forced to use information they would not normally. They were compared to a group for which the reverse was true. The upper body information was preserved while the lower body cues were neutralized. What was found? Overall, both training groups improved in their ability to anticipate, but the group that had the upper body and racket cues neutralized did better when tested under conditions when the server was not altered. That is, when all cues were available, as they would be in the real game. In experiment 3 of this study, a different set of novice participants were trained in the same set of conditions, but with one small but important difference. Instead of neutralizing the information from half of the body, that is, making it not vary as a function of serve direction, either the upper or lower part of the server was occluded. What was found? Surprisingly, the results were quite different, as the group that could only see the lower part of the body of the server did not improve from the start to the end of training. This is in many ways similar to a finding from the Jacobs and Michaels billiard ball study I talked about last episode. It seems like education of attention to different perceptual variables occurs much more readily when we can actually experience that a variable is not useful for our task, rather than having it occluded in some way. I think this has some really interesting implications for coaching. If a coach can somehow neutralize the information that athletes typically use and make it useless in practice, they may develop the ability to use other information sources than they normally would pick up. Maybe this could be done by having someone do a lot of reps against a teammate that is particularly good at not giving away what they're going to do via body language. Or, we of course could use a VR simulation to create a more interactive version of the stick figures that Smeaton and colleagues used. The other 2 studies I wanted to talk about this episode are related to one of the other processes involved in perceptual learning I discussed last episode, calibration. These were both done by John Vanderkamp and colleagues from VU University in Amsterdam. The first study, published by Van Leer et al. In 2011, examined calibration in the context of golf putting. It was focused on a curious perceptual error that golfers make. When asked to make judgments about the aiming line between the ball and the hole while addressing the ball, both highly skilled and unskilled golfers make overshoot errors in the perceptual judgment. That is, when asked to align a pointer with one end at the ball and the other end at the hole, standing to the left of the pointer results in clockwise alignment errors, while standing to the right results in counterclockwise alignment errors. It is in fact generally true that we will make direction errors like this whenever we're not aligned with the pointer itself, which would be standing behind the ball in golf instead of standing parallel to it when making a putt. For novices, these perceptual errors seem to translate into putting performance errors. Specifically, there's a significant correlation between the size of the error in the pointer alignment task and how much the golfer misses the hole by when actually putting from the same location. But this is not true for skilled golfers, as when asked to putt the ball as they normally would, there is no correlation at all between the misalignment errors in the perceptual task and the action errors in terms of where the ball ends up. However, a significant correlation does occur if you ask expert golfers to putt from the opposite side of the ball that they would normally do. For example, switching from left-handed to right-handed putting. In many ways, this is reminiscent of the soccer dribbling findings of Bylock and colleagues, which I talked about back in episode 7. If you recall in that study, it was found that when dribbling with their dominant foot, expert soccer players had no problem performing a secondary task that involved listening for target words. But when they switched to their non-dominant foot, they acted like novices, in that they could not do both tasks at the same time. Again, expertise is highly specific, not some universal property. But back to the golf putting study. So, for expert golfers putting from their normal side, perceptual errors do not translate into action errors. Why might this be the case? Van Leer and colleagues considered two main possibilities. First, it is possible that the expert golfers have educated their attention to different perceptual variables while actually putting than the lesser skilled players. This seemed to be a likely possibility because it was observed that experts position their head and eyes differently than lesser skilled golfers. Specifically, they tended to keep their head over the ball while novices were more behind the ball. It's possible that this difference created a difference in the optical information available for aligning the ball, so that no perceptual distortion actually occurs when putting for experts. Note, this difference in the head position tended to be only present when making the actual putts, not when doing the perceptual judgment of alignment. A second possibility is that experts may have simply learned to correct for this perceptual distortion by changing the relationship between the optical information and their movement. Think of it like a gun sight that is slightly misaligned. When your first shot misses the target 2 inches to the left, you just move the gun barrel 2 inches to the right on the next shot. This, of course, is an example of calibration. The experts are still picking up the same perceptual information, but differ in the manner in which it's used to control the action of putting. So which one was it? To address this question, the authors looked at two different things. First, they had participants perform the perceptual alignment task using a head mount, so that their head and eyes were always aligned over the ball. What was found? Perceptual errors did not go away, suggesting that better alignment with the ball does not create more accurate perceptual information. Next, they looked at the relationship between the perceptual errors in alignment and how the golfers actually lined up the putt before executing it. Expert golfers who had perceptual errors that were offset to the right were found to line up slightly to the left of this when actually putting. So, through practice, they clearly learned to cancel out the perceptual error through a calibration process. Presumably, perceiving that the ball tends to miss the hole to the right when they were a novice resulted in them aiming the next putt slightly more to the left of their perceived aiming line, thereby scaling the relationship between the optical variable that specifies the direction and the putting movement. In an interesting follow-up study also published in 2011, Van Leer and colleagues looked at to what extent calibration of perception can transfer to calibration of action. Specifically, they compared two training groups: a perception training group that learned to get rid of errors in perceptual judgments of alignment via feedback, and an action training group that learned to reduce errors in putting direction via feedback. What was found? Both groups effectively eliminated their errors, but only for the specific task they were trained on. That is, the perception training group still made errors in the putting task, while the action training group still made errors in the perceptual alignment task. So no transfer of training. This again brings into question the validity of purely passive perceptual training in sports. If an athlete gets better at making perceptual judgments, it is likely not to translate into using the same perceptual information more effectively when performing the action itself. These results are actually highly similar to what I found in a simulated catching study back in 2006. Participants initially made both errors in the perception of the direction of motion and depth, and had their hand in slightly the wrong location to intercept the virtual approaching ball. When I gave feedback, they showed no evidence of calibrating their perception, but did improve in their catching action. So in a nutshell, for effective calibration of perceptual information to occur, we really need to keep perception and action coupled. So, to sum up, over the past 3 episodes I've looked at the fascinating process of perceptual learning, whereby we come to use the information available to us more effectively. I think this is a key ability that is fundamental to being an expert in most sports, but is often overlooked in research, so I'll be touching on it again in future episodes. Coming soon on the Perception and Action podcast, a review of articles that you can help me choose via the short survey I posted on perceptionaction.com/survey1. Remember, as always, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or on Twitter @ShakyWeights. And to find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now.